Well, welcome, folks, to this edition of the 700 Club. You know, I don't know if you're like me, but every so often I read something that just absolutely shocks the daylights out of me, and I'm shocked. I'm looking shocked. And I want to ask you, Terry, would you like to get shocked?
Well, I want to know what shocks you.
All right, I want to ask you a question. When you and your husband and maybe a couple of children go on a vacation, say you go to Florida for a week's vacation, how much money would you spend? Be honest. I mean, you know, if it's a million.
A week in Florida, probably $2,500, maybe.
$2,500. That includes travel, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, now, if you were the man of the people, I mean, you were representative of the so-called downtrodden middle class, and you could charge your vacations to the federal government, how much would you charge them?
I'd be afraid if somebody could keep tab of it to let anybody know if I did it was too extreme.
Well, guess what the man who occupies the White House over 8 years has spent on personal travel and vacations going back and forth to Hawaii, Martha's Vineyard, etc.?
I have no idea.
Give it a wild guess. The wildest guess you could imagine.
$1 million?
Oh, come on. We're talking about the champion of the middle class. The man who stands up for the poor, downtrodden people in the inner cities.
Yes.
$85 million of taxpayer money has gone for Mr. Obama's vacation, travel, and personal travel. $85 million. And that was the report in today's news.
That is a little shocking.
A man of the people.
Yeah.
And also I learned today that the other lady who is the woman of the people got $20 million in speaking fees. She and her husband pulled in about, what was it, $150 million?
Yeah. Well, that's not so shocking because those numbers have been out for
I know, but the vacation, $85 million bucks.
Wow.
Back and forth to Hawaii, back and forth to Martha.
That's why you need the speaking engagements to support. That's why you need the speaking engagements to support your vacations.
But he bills that to the taxpayer.
Yeah.
And Secret Service and all the people who go along, and the chase planes and the big plane and the other plane and the big...
Well, is some of that, I'm unfamiliar with that. Is some of that not required for the Commander-in-Chief?
Well,
I mean, you would think.
I think the Commander-in-Chief could be a little more circumspect. He could take a vacation in the Outer Banks of North Carolina, for example. It'd be a whole lot cheaper.
Yeah. You know, for how much it costs when the Commander-in-Chief comes to town, a lot of people are saying, don't vacation.
$85 million bucks. Ladies and gentlemen, you know, what's happening is, and this is really true, there's been a reversal. It used to be the Democrats were the party of the poor and the working class and the laboring men and women. Now, they are the party of the plutocrats. They're the party of the very super rich. And you look on the West Coast, all those media people are multimillionaires. They give them big money. The Wall Street guys give them big money. And so it turns out the Republicans have become the party of the working class. And that's what Donald Trump, even though he's got a cabinet of very wealthy people, some of them are quite wealthy, nevertheless, the thrust is to help the poor, the people who are out of work, the folks who work for Carrier and so forth, to keep their jobs. It's amazing. There's been a switch, but look at it. I mean, just watch what's happening. There's been a dramatic shift. And now, on the East Coast and the West Coast, these are the plutocrats. These are the people who are out of touch with the common people, the middle class in the heartland of America. Well, the president isn't taking anything for granted. He wants to say thank you. So he's going to North Carolina today on his way of saying thanks to the voters who put him in the White House. And he's expanding his search for a Secretary of State, even as Democrats are criticizing, bitterly criticizing, some of his cabinet choices.
Well, Trump is taking his trip today after a surprise meeting with one of the nation's top Democrats, someone who has very different views than Trump on global warming. Charlene Aaron has the story.
It certainly wasn't a meeting anyone expected after Donald Trump called the idea of man-made climate change a hoax on the campaign trail. But Monday, there was former Vice President Al Gore, one of the most famous climate activists in the world, leaving after meeting with the president-elect at Trump Tower in New York. And all he would say was,
I found it an extremely interesting conversation and to be continued. And I'm just going to leave it at that.
Trump told the New York Times after the election there may be what he called some connectivity between human activity and climate change. But Reince Priebus, who will be Trump's chief of staff, told Fox News Trump still thinks global warming is mainly a bunch of bunk. Meanwhile, Trump is still searching for a possible Secretary of State, meeting today with the CEO of ExxonMobil, Rex Tillerson, along with Henry Kissinger, who worked in the Nixon and Ford administrations. Trump also met Monday with Robert McFarland, who served as National Security Advisor under President Reagan in the mid-1980s. And a new recording has surfaced on the website The Intercept with Trump's nominee for Secretary of Defense, retired Marine General James Mad Dog Mattis, talking about the Iraq War last year during a question and answer session at a conference for global security professionals. Mattis was an important military leader during that war, but at the conference he said this.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will probably look back on the invasion of Iraq as a mistake, as a strategic mistake.
Trump himself has been extremely critical of the U.S. intervention in Iraq, and Democrats quickly criticized another one of Trump's cabinet choices, retired neurosurgeon Dr. Ben Carson, to head up the Department of Housing and Urban Development. House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi called Carson a disconcerting and disturbingly unqualified choice. An incoming Senate Minority Leader Charles Schumer of New York also questioned Carson's qualifications, saying, "I have serious concerns about Dr. Carson's lack of expertise and experience in dealing with housing issues. Someone who is as anti-government as him is a strange fit for housing secretary, to say the least." As for Trump himself, he took on the media again Monday, putting out this statement on Twitter to explain why he tweets so often. "If the press would cover me accurately and honorably, I would have far less reason to tweet. Sadly, I don't know if that will ever happen." Charlene Aaron, CBN News.
Thank you, Charlene. You know, unqualified. We have a president whose only qualification was he's a community organizer. He never held a job in the private sector, and he learned his organizing skills from a well-known radical who had a handbook for revolutionaries. He went to the Senate where he did, as far as I can tell, next to nothing. He made a tremendous speech in front of the Democrat convention, and that catapulted him into the presidency. That was it. And now we've got a man who is a brilliant neurosurgeon who knows intimately the problems of the inner cities, is well qualified to take care of this. And when you get right down to it, what HUD, the thing with HUD is that they loan a lot of money to people. They guarantee loans for folks to build housing projects, and what they do is pretty good. But you don't have to micromanage that one. But if you have a concern about what part of the country needs help and where they could have some affordable housing, then Ben Carson's the man. But to say that he's not qualified compared to the, I mean, Bernie Sanders didn't take a paycheck. He was a bum. He didn't have any income at all. I think he was 30 years old. And then the only job he got was working for a city. And most of these Democrats have never been in the private sector in their lives. So who's qualified, Senator? Well, one problem the new Secretary of Defense is going to face is the wasteful spending at the Pentagon. John Jessup has that.
Matt, that's right, and that's because the Defense Department reportedly has uncovered, or rather covered up, an internal study that showed a huge amount of administrative waste in its business operations. The study uncovering far more wasteful spending than expected, to the tune of an estimated $125 billion that could be saved over 5 years. The Washington Post reports the Pentagon buried the study because it was afraid it could lead to potential spending cuts from Congress and undermine claims from Defense Department officials that budget cuts have left the armed forces starved for funding. The paper points out President-elect Donald Trump has promised a major military buildup, which he said he would pay for by eliminating government waste and budget gimmicks. Pat, that's an awful lot of money.
Well, it's a terrible amount of money, and what's being suggested, and I really would applaud this, we have a former Speaker of the House of Representatives, Newt Gingrich, who is an expert on military affairs, and he's really a fine strategic thinker. And if they would appoint a commission, like the Grace Commission, you know, I worked for Peter Grace for a while, they did a superb job in showing areas of waste and duplication in the government, and it was completely ignored by Congress. I mean, totally ignored. It was a brilliant study by about 2,000 leading businessmen in our nation. If Newt Gingrich would have a blue ribbon panel of people who would know that their work would be taken into consideration, they could come up with an enormous study of how we can stop waste and duplication. There's some of these agencies, there's 16 duplications, for example, or 22 or 30 or 40 or 50 agencies that duplicate what each one's doing. They don't talk to each other. This government is a mess. It is so huge, and we just can't afford it any longer. So, yes, so the Pentagon, and it's a game. It's a game. They can't show Congress that they don't need any more money, so they've got to say, well, we're poor, we haven't got any money. But waste, duplication, it's terrible. John?
Pat, turning overseas, leaders of the European Union say they aren't concerned despite another vote against the EU, this time from Italy, amid a growing movement away from the idea of a unified Europe. Dale Hurd has that story.
European leaders insist the EU will be fine, even after the biggest body blow to hit it since Brexit, the British vote to leave. The vote in Italy was not intended to be a vote of confidence on the European Union, but it became a vote against the establishment and against the status quo, both in Brussels and in Rome. The vote was whether to streamline the Constitution and give more power to the Prime Minister, but it turned into a symbolic referendum on the European Union, and the EU lost. This man who voted no said, "We could not go on any longer like this. The Italian people cannot take it anymore. If authorities don't understand, then slowly we will make them understand." Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi had promised to resign if the referendum was defeated. The vote has energized Italy's anti-establishment Five-Star movement and the right-wing Northern League. Italian bank stocks are getting battered, and it's feared the world's oldest bank, Monte dei Paschi, is now at risk of going under. Still, in Brussels, finance ministers believe the EU can absorb it.
I'm not going to comment on the what-if situation. Again, I'm confident that there will be no such crisis, and I'm confident that we have the means to resist to any kind of political shock in Europe.
But there are more shocks on the way. Europe is slowly but surely turning right and away from the dream of a European superstate. Soon, only Angela Merkel will be standing among the coalition of world leaders who pushed European integration. The man who could be the next president of France, François Hollande, has called for more French sovereignty. His likely opponent in the next election, Marine Le Pen, is rooting for an EU collapse, as is the leader of the most popular party in the Netherlands, Geert Wilders.
Of course, there is Euroscepticism. The same is true in France, in Italy, in Greece, in Finland. Different types of Euroscepticisms, by the way.
And it continues to eat away at European integration. EU leaders may be confident, but it's clear they're losing the confidence of more and more Europeans. Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Thanks, Dale. Pat, are we witnessing the collapse of the European Union?
I think we definitely are. Bret Stephens had a very insightful column in the Wall Street Journal today. I think that would commend your reading. The idea is that the common people, the working people, the middle class, whatever you want to call them, have felt left out. And we have turned the leadership of our nations over to a faceless bureaucracy who are imposing rules and regulations out of places like Brussels. And that's what happened in England. The British say, look, we're not going to let these bureaucrats tell us what to do any longer. Same thing in Italy, the same thing up and down in France. The socialists and the progressives and so forth have loaded burdens and regulations that are insupportable, and they're not looking after the people. And the people say, we've had it. In America, think about it. Who got bailed out? The banks, the big bankers got bailed out. Huge sums of money was spent on bailing out the banks. Well, what about the guys on Main Street, the little business there? Well, they were allowed to fail. They went broke. But the big bankers were putting huge amounts of money. Their paychecks were obscene. Some of the hedge fund managers were pulling down as much as $1 billion a year in salary. And the people of America said, we can't stand this. We're losing jobs. You put together all these international programs that are killing our jobs, killing our businesses, and you don't seem to care because you make a lot of money. So there's a revolt. And I think right now, the euro, as I said yesterday, is almost at parity with the United States dollar. It has been as high as $1.35 or more. And the euro, it was the only thing holding them together. They really didn't have a political union they should have had. But they have individual states. The Italians have their way of doing things. The Greeks have their way. The Russians have their way. Maybe the Russians not in there, but the Germans have their way, and the Brits have theirs. And they like their heritage and their individual sovereignty. So the chances of the EU falling apart are very, very real. But that is necessarily a good thing. It could hurt us all. But I'd look for that in the future, because this move in Italy is one of them. And the fact that Greece and Spain and Portugal are near bankruptcy, I mean, it's not a good situation. Well, we've been talking over the years about a woman named Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of Planned Parenthood, which takes down as much as $500 million in taxpayer money every year. John has more on that.
Pat, Planned Parenthood hails, as you said, founder Margaret Sanger as a champion of civil rights. But one thing it doesn't talk about is the racism behind her fight to legalize abortion. A group of African-American leaders wants to focus attention on her ideology and how it affected black birth rates. Abigail Robertson brings us that story.
Margaret Sanger strived for a society that limited births to only those she deemed fit to have children.
Well, I think the greatest sin in the world is bringing children into the world that have disease from their parents, that have no chance in the world to be a human being, practically. Delinquents, prisoners, all sorts of things just marked when they're born. That, to me, is the greatest sin.
Many pro-choice advocates see her as a hero, but critics call her a racist eugenics promoter who targeted black communities with her Planned Parenthood clinics.
Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, once said, colored people are like weeds, they need to be exterminated.
People don't understand that 79% of Planned Parenthood clinics are located in minority communities, and that minority communities shoulder a disproportionate amount of abortion.
Dr. King says while African Americans make up only 13% of the U.S. population, over 30% of aborted babies are from black mothers.
Under the veil of secrecy and deception, 60+ million babies have not been born because they were aborted legally since '73. 1/3 of that population belong to the African American community.
Planned Parenthood recently celebrated its 100th anniversary, prompting pro-life leaders to unite under the banner 100 No More to educate the public on the harmful impact Planned Parenthood has had on the African American community. 100 No More hope rallies like this one in Washington spread across the country to enlighten people about Sanger and her tragic legacy.
I have a real serious concern about the number of abortions that's taking place in the minority community, particularly the black community, and that I see this as a form of genocide. That is something we need to take a serious look at.
Planned Parenthood receives around $500 million each year from taxpayers.
96% of the time, if a pregnant woman walks into their clinic, that she will have an abortion.
Pro-life advocates want Congress to move that money to women's clinics that do not perform abortions.
They outnumber already around the country Planned Parenthood clinics 20-1. They truly help poor women. They truly care for the least of these, but they don't do abortions.
Reporting from Washington, Abigail Robertson, CBN News.
Thanks, Abigail. Pat, back to you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, there it is, and it's the absolute truth. There's a little pamphlet that I got my hands on several years ago. It's called Breeding the Thoroughbred. It was written by Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, and it goes into detail. Margaret Sanger wanted to sterilize not only black people, but Southern European people and evangelical Protestants and others that she figured were not fit. And she thought to sterilize them was one way of not having them give birth to any more children. And she was especially harsh about African Americans. So to think that Dr. Martin Luther King's daughter is speaking out in this fashion, to me, is rather important, that they wake up to the fact that this has been black genocide. And when I heard Hillary Clinton say, well, I'm 100% for Planned Parenthood, I don't want to cut any of their funding, there's some of the things she said in that debate was so hard and so harsh that I think it turned a lot of people against her during this campaign. And they say, well, we lost because of ABC. Well, one of the things you lost for is the fact that you espoused causes that were out of step with the mainstream of America. And so, Abigail, thank you for that report.